to me, you'll stop sharing so I can access stuff on my computer differently.
Yeah, we're broadcasting now. So then,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. So now I'm going to share my screen. I just realized I'm going to need another laptop. Or maybe I can pull it up on my phone. All right, I can't tell if we have anybody here, but I think we're broadcasting. And, well, let me see if I can open this up here. I'll be back right 1 second. All right. Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody out to our session here, Mormons and Myths, Mormons and Native Americans, Myths and Realities. And so about this presentation, Brigham Young is quoted as having said that Native Americans, quote, "It is cheaper to feed them than to fight them." Due to this and the Mormon belief that Native Americans are descended from Book of Mormon peoples, it is a common myth that 19th century Mormons were always kind to Native Americans. The reality is they drove Native Americans from their ancestral lands and committed a number of murders and even massacres against them. This session will discuss the myths versus the realities of Mormons and Native Americans. I'll take a second to introduce to you the speakers before we begin. Sarah Newcomb is Native American. I'm going to have a hard time, Sarah, here. Simeon of the First Nations. Okay, thank you. Her tribe represents Metlakatla, Alaska, and is the only reservation in the state. She was a 7th generation Mormon. She now works as a freelance writer and editor who researches Mormon and Native American history and relations. Andrew Hamilton is a Sunstone AV volunteer. He blogs about Mormon history at withoutend.org and has reviewed Mormon history books for about 15 years. Joseph Geisner is an independent Mormon researcher who collects rare books, writes book reviews, and speaks at history conferences. He is published in the Journal of Mormon History, Sunstone, John Whitmer Historical Association, Iriantum, and on various LDS-oriented websites. Along with Lavina Fielding Anderson, he created the Chronology for Confessions of a Mormon Historian, the Diaries of Leonard J. Arrington, 1971 to 1999, edited by Gary J. Bergera. He is currently on the board of directors for the John Whitmer Historical Association. An anthology that Joe edited was recently released from Signature Books, Writing Mormon History, Historians and Their Books. He lives with his wife of more than 30 years in Northern California, where they provide residential services for people with developmental disabilities. The Geisners have 3 children. I'll now give the floor to our presenters. We will have a Q&A at the end, so we're going to end right on time in about an hour, at 9:30. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
All right. Hi, everyone. Amagalakak, Tanis Newsome. Good morning to you all. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Newcomb. I'm Tsimshian of the First Nations. My tribe's actually from Canada in the British Columbia area, and I'm from a small group that migrated to Alaska in 1887 and established a community called New Metlakatla. I was born and raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I was not only Mormon, I was Lamanite. Lamanite is what the church has identified Native Americans as, known as the descendants of the people in the Book of Mormon. Now, I was not raised with this as a myth or a possibility, but as a fact. This was my literal, direct ancestry. What that meant for how I viewed the Book of Mormon teachings is that it was not only factual Native American history, but it was my ancestral history. So reading and learning every Sunday was not only lessons about God, but also historical lessons about my ancestors. Basically, growing up, I combined Native American history and the stories of Book of Mormon. At a young age, I became aware that there were no other Native Americans at school or church. And one day I asked my mom, what happened to all the Native Americans? Where were the people that were like us? I knew in Alaska, I would find people, but we were living in Virginia at the time, and in the area we lived in, there were none. And I was given the Book of Mormon history lesson about how God loved us Lamanites, and that he had warned us that if we turned away from him, we would lose his spirit and his protection of our promised land, and that other people would come, but that God provided a way for us to return to him. As a child, I was encouraged to see the hope in God's love, but that lesson always stayed with me, especially in my teen years, as I began studying scriptures more. In chapter 1 of 2nd Nephi, Lehi's close to death, and he's spending time with his kids and grandkids, and he's talking to his sons, Laman and Lemuel, and he warns them, and I'm going to summarize verses 9 through 11. In verse 9, Lehi obtains a promise from God, the promised land, and he tells his sons they shall prosper upon the land, and it shall be kept from other nations, that they would possess the land unto themselves. Lehi tells his sons that if they keep the commandments, they shall be blessed, and there shall be none to molest them or take away the land of their inheritance, that they'll dwell safely. In verse 10, Lehi explains that if the day shall come that they reject the Holy One of Israel, the true Messiah, the judgments of him that is just shall rest upon them. In verse 11, Lehi tells his sons that this will result in God bringing other nations to the promised land, and that those nations would be given power over Laman and Lemuel's descendants, to take away from them the land of their possessions, and that God would cause the people to be scattered and smitten. These scriptures were always painful to me in my teen years. I was disappointed, to say the least, in my ancestors. They had turned away from God, just as Father Lehi had warned, and as a result, the people were no longer protected. They lost God's protection of the promised land. If only my ancestors had been righteous. Native American children, families, and communities would not have been harmed. Instead of viewing it academically as humans fighting over resources, which is well documented, it instead becomes about one group of humans being unrighteous and losing God's protection, and another group being righteous. And the only path to redemption for the unrighteous in the Lamanite myth is to reject Native American and indigenous incorrect beliefs and join God's church. Now, I know that's heavy. And like I said, I was the kid who read the Book of Mormon as a literal history of my Native American ancestors. And I took it as seriously as I took history classes at school. But I'm not the only Native American. who was taught it was a history of our people. How did this belief that the Book of Mormon is Native American history impact Mormon views and relations? In November of 1835, Joseph Smith recorded his first vision in his personal journal and stated the following: "I was about 14 years old when I received this first communication. When I was about 17 years old, I saw another vision of angels." Joseph goes on to record this second vision in his journal, and at the end he writes the following: "He told me of a sacred record which was written on plates of gold. I saw in the vision the place where they were deposited. He said the Indians were the literal descendants of Abraham." In this, there are some challenges with myth versus reality, as DNA and archaeology have already proven. But more importantly, it completely ignores the voices in history of Native American nations themselves, what they have already said about their own people's origins. It labels their knowledge as false, or at the very least, incomplete. So Lamanites turned away from God. God cursed them by completely abandoning them, which to me actually showed a real level of evil, to have God completely abandon the millions of people labeled Lamanite. As a result, they lose protection of their promised land. And then the dark skin was a sign of this curse. So growing up, the skin of my people, my skin, was actually a reminder of unrighteous ancestry. Now some will say, when the Book of Mormon says skin, it's not skin. The current official teaching, however, is still skin. For example, as a child, we had the Children's Book of Mormon stories book. Some of you may recognize it. I don't know if you can see it there. This is the current edition. It also comes in different languages. I have a Japanese version here. And as a child, I knew that it was skin, not just because of the words, but because of the pictures. So I'm gonna, hopefully I don't mess this up, I'm gonna bring up the PowerPoint. You can see, I took some pictures of this. And here are the two copies I have, the English and the Japanese version. Now in this first picture, this is where Lehi grew old, and before he died, he talked to his sons and told them to obey God's commandments. He also blessed his grandchildren. This is in 2 Nephi chapter 1. This is the same chapter where earlier in which I read about Lehi's counseling his sons, Laman and Lemuel, to be obedient to God or risk losing protection. And just take a minute to note the fair skin and the clothing of the righteous people. In this next image, we see Laman and Lemuel's followers called themselves Lamanites. They became a dark-skinned people. God cursed them because of their wickedness. Please note the appearance of the Lamanites once God darkened them as a sign of the curse. Their hair, their clothing. They look Native American. Here's the Japanese Lamanites. It's a different image in the Japanese book. And again, note skin tone, clothing, features. And this is read to children around the world in different languages. As a child, this definitely impacted me. These books impact Indigenous children everywhere. But how do these beliefs impact Mormon relations with Indigenous people and Indigenous children? In Sunday school as a child, I had a teacher awkwardly pause during a lesson and point out that I was Lamanite. All the kids turned to look at me while I froze uncomfortably, and they studied me. This wasn't the first time, and it wasn't the last. Another example of Mormon relations with children. In primary, I loved singing time, and the song Book of Mormon Stories was both really fun. I'd get excited to sing it because of the beat, but it was also difficult. As the only Indigenous child, surrounded with all my beautiful friends who were white, we were all raising our hands behind our head with 2 fingers extended to represent Native American feathers. As we sang the words, all about the Lamanites in ancient history. Long ago their fathers came from far across the sea, given the land, if they lived righteously. if they lived righteously. Even as a child, I understood they hadn't. In verse 2, the land is welcoming others. As a teenager, especially once I began seminary, it was impossible not to connect all these dots and be impacted on a personal level. During my teen years, I also studied Native American history in any book I could get my hands on. I was heartbroken by the trauma I read about. If only my ancestors had been righteous, families and children would not have been harmed. If only my ancestors had been better people. I felt lucky I was born into a church that would redeem my people. Sadly, at the time, I did not know that my people didn't need redemption. One of the early books I read in my teen years talked about the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Joseph Smith viewed government actions during those years as the gathering of Israel. History of the Church, Volume 2, Chapter 26, a special council meeting is held with Joseph Smith, and I'll read a few excerpts from what he said. It reads, "The gathering of Israel and the American Indians. Much has been said and done of late by the general government in relation to the Indians within the territorial limits of the United States. One of the most important points in the faith of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, through the fullness of the everlasting gospel, is the gathering of Israel, of whom the Lamanites constitute a part." On the following page, Joseph continues and says, "In speaking of the gathering, we mean to be understood as speaking of it according to Scripture. The gathering of the elect of the Lord out of every nation on earth." A little further on, Joseph says, "The Book of Mormon has made known who Israel is upon this continent. And while we behold the government of the United States gathering the Indians and locating them upon lands to be their own, how sweet it is to think that they may one day be gathered by the gospel." Lands to be their own after they're being removed from their ancestral lands. Now, while these beliefs from Joseph were hopeful and in a way held some beauty, they come at a cost for the indigenous who have to carry these beliefs and what happened to them with myth as explanation instead of reality, as the Trail of Tears being God's plan for them instead of human history and humans fighting over resources. Now, we can all agree the Trail of Tears was terrible. Even Joseph Smith himself wanted to soften the blow of what was being done during those years and instead see a spiritual message. Still, when those beliefs are placed upon a vulnerable people suffering genocide and forced removal, and the reason for their suffering is being ordained by God, that does change things. Mormons were no different in that they took resources and forced indigenous people off of ancestral lands. But again, humans fight over resources. When religion is added to it, it changes this from being about resources to being about good versus not so good, favored by God versus not as favored. And those Native Americans who would join the church and be redeemed versus those that hung on to incorrect Native American traditions. In March of 1849, Brigham Young said, "The old Indians will not enter into the new and everlasting covenant or gain knowledge, but they will die and be damned." In January of 1850, Brigham Young said, "We have no peace until the men are killed off. Never treat the Indian as your equal." Brigham Young went on to order all the men to be killed and let the women and children live if they behave themselves. Not all the women and children lived. I'm not going to get into the ugliness of what was done to the indigenous people during these years, but it was traumatic. Many years later, on April 9th of 1871, Brigham Young gave a discourse in the New Tabernacle, and he said, "There is a curse on these aborigines of our country, who roam the plains and are so wild that you cannot tame them. They are of the house of Israel. They once had the gospel delivered to them. They had oracles of truth. Jesus came and administered until the 4th generation, when they turned away and became so wicked that God cursed them with this dark and benighted and loathsome condition. And they want to sit on the ground in the dirt and to live by hunting, and they cannot be civilized. And right upon this, I will say to our government, if they could hear me, you need never fight the Indians, but if you want to get rid of them, try to civilize them. How many were here when we came, at Warm Springs, at this little grove where they would pitch their tents? We found perhaps 300. But I do not suppose that there are 3 of that bank left alive now. There were another band, a little south, another north, another further east. But I do not suppose there is 1 in 10, perhaps not 1 in 100, now alive of those who were here when we came. In 1873, Mormons received significant financial compensation from the government for dealing with the Indians. Utah legislature wrote a bill titled Memorial of the Legislative Assembly of Utah. They sent it to Congress, referred it to the Committee of Military Affairs, and were awarded $1.5 million for costs incurred dealing with Indians. According to the inflation rate in today's market, that would translate to just around $30 million. $30 million to deal with Indians and take their land, for the land belonged to God's people. Here is a quote from a Timpanogos tribal member. By the year 1909, most of our leaders were killed, many of them in the Black Hawk War. Our population decreased from approximately 70,000 to about 1,300. Today, our population is close to 900. The newcomers call us the Lamanites, the chosen people. We were chosen to walk knee-deep in the blood of our ancestors. Again, we see indigenous people carrying their trauma as God's will within the Lamanite band. Eventually, as the years passed, missionary work with those labeled Lamanite increased. Here I have a bunch of handouts. I collect the missionary handouts that they had. There's one called A Voice Calling. It was handed out in the Southwest Indian Mission in Gallup. The main one I wanted to show everybody today is called Who Are You? I'm gonna switch to share. Okay, who are you? You native peoples of the Americas, who are commonly designated by the name Indians, who are you? Where did you come from? Do you know that your ancestors were once a mighty nation upon the American continent? And you can see indigenous young adults pictured. Here there's a picture of ancient ruins in Central America. Evidences of great nations of your people have been found on this continent. The next one is a picture of the Book of Mormon, and it says, but the best source of information which is true and which tells us who you are, where you come from, and what is to become of you is found in an important book, the Book of Mormon. Here we have a picture of the Book of Mormon, the Isles, people in the Isles of the Sea, so Pacific Islanders. And it says, the Lamanites were marked by the Lord with a darker skin. During some periods of your history, the Lamanites were wicked, while at other times, they were obedient to God's commandments. This image is of a family that was labeled as Lamanite and says, the missionaries from the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, showing the Book of Mormon to a Lamanite family. This pamphlet was given to indigenous people all over the United States and beyond. I want to read just a few of those off. Alaska, British Columbia Mission. Alberta, Saskatchewan Mission. Arizona, Australia, Brazil, California, Central America, Chile, Colorado, New York, England, Hawaii, a number of United States locations, New Zealand, South Dakota, Southwest Indian Mission, Ontario, Quebec, Switzerland. To understand Native American history, researching what was taught to families, and especially what was taught to children, is crucial, including programs like the Church's Indian Placement Program, also known as the Lamanite Placement Program. Erasure and generations of trauma. Indigenous people have been taught that the Lamanite identity was accurate and historical. But this is an old handout, right? Like, this can still be current. So I'm going to share an excerpt from a transcription of a conversation I had in 2018 with a missionary, in which I was taught the following. The missionary said, "The Lamanites became the Native Americans who were in the Americas when Columbus came and settled the land. That's why there was no religion established in the land when Columbus came, because the Lamanites didn't believe in Christ." A few months later, in that same year, another missionary taught me about dark skin being a sign of the curse. When I challenged them, the missionary said, "Not all people of the world. We only know of the Lamanites. We need to recognize this was one situation under these circumstances 2,000 years ago. It is not saying all Black people are wicked or cursed at all." I came away from that understanding that we only know of the Lamanites. Before missions, most youth go through seminary. And in the current Teacher's Seminary Manual, lesson 27, at the bottom, it explains that the Lamanite skin was darkened and gives the reason why. The lesson goes on to state that the Lamanites did become an idle people, full of mischief and subtlety. This is demeaning to the beautiful indigenous ways of life. This year's Come Follow Me manual has similar information on skin darkening. Though it was removed from the online version, it is still in the printed copies on location at church buildings around the world. Another example of myths affecting Mormon relations in modern times, in August of 2019, at the BYU Education Week, beliefs about Christopher Columbus were taught. Active and believing Native American members came out of the woodwork and tried to just speak and educate about this issue. They pointed out that Christopher Columbus's name was never specified in the Book of Mormon, nor was any location of where the Great Waters were located specified. They also explained the problems with Columbus himself. Once again, Native American voices were invisible in Mormon relations. Their own knowledge of their history was ignored, and the Native American knowledge was set aside for interpretations and myth. The church responded 5 months later in the brand new Come Follow Me manual. It teaches that it is specifically Christopher Columbus that the Book of Mormon scripture is referring. That scripture is found in 1 Nephi 13:12, and it reads, "And I looked and beheld a man among the Gentiles who was separated from the seed of my brethren by many waters. And I beheld the Spirit of God, that it came down and wrought upon the man. And he went forth upon many waters, even unto the seed of my brethren, who were in the promised land." If anyone has been officially labeled in modern times as Lamanites, the Christopher Columbus teachings and the location of the Great Waters undeniably labels the gentle Taino people who greeted Columbus as Lamanites, the seed of Laman and Lemuel. The Tainos who were decimated by Columbus and his men, the horrific things done to their children, their people, the genocide, all because their ancestors did not remain righteous. If only their ancestors had heeded Lehi's warning, the promised land would have been protected, and the Tainos might not have perished. The burden is placed at their own ancestors' feet. Indigenous, ancestral appropriation. The genocide of the Tainos by the hands of Christopher Columbus and his men was not doctrine of discovery or manifest destiny, with God's hands punishing non-Christian indigenous families for their ancestors' mistakes. The trail of tears was not the result of unrighteous ancestry or God's will. This is difficult human history, and myth versus reality is important. If perhaps we stopped placing myths on real people and replaced their history with reality, it frees both the people's ancestry from appropriation and also frees the spirituality in what Mormons hold as sacred texts. The spiritual stories are no longer trapped by interpretations, and relations between indigenous people and the church might improve. Religion is an extremely personal experience, yet we share it with all those around us. When we speak of the Lamanite myth, or myths around Mormon relations, it is easy to get caught up in adult conversations, in the wars, in history, in religious theories, and in the academics. But myth versus reality had and still has a massive impact on developing children now. Another generation of Native American children singing the Book of Mormon story song in which Lamanites were given land, but only if they lived righteously. Another generation of children raised with dark skin being a sign of their ancestors' curse in official church doctrine. And now a generation of children being raised with Christopher Columbus teachings included in the new official 2020 manual. There are many ways to express and honor spirituality and faith. They should not come at the cost of children and their developing identities. When this myth is placed on real living people, it perpetuates the very traumas their parents, grandparents, and generations have fought to survive. I'm proud that my people survived. I'm proud that they actively found peace in the various religions they eventually joined. In Tsimshian philosophy, life isn't a straight line, it is circular. It is okay to be proud of older generations' paths and the beauty of their survival and their search for peace, as well as respecting and protecting the younger generations as they make their path. When it comes to Native American history within Mormonism and myth versus reality, you will hear conflicting feelings from Indigenous people themselves, some incredibly positive, some negative, and many in between. Regardless, they are all valid. As Native Americans continue to revive their languages and heal their people, there's space for different experiences and there's space to different paths for healing, including within Mormonism. What would this world look like if every choice made by those in power was measured by how it respected children? What if we were honest with the children and with ourselves? With that, I'd love to turn it over to Joe Geisner. You have to unmute the...
Yeah, I am so sorry. Well, we need to explain. We had a little technical problem this morning. For some reason, my laptop sounds horrible, and it's a strange. Okay. As I was listening to Sarah this morning, and I've gotten to know Sarah over the last year or so, and find her to be one of the more thoughtful people that's come into my life, and I'm grateful for that. But as I was listening to her, I had all these emotions go through me, and some are embarrassing, some are wonderful, and the most embarrassing, and I actually told Sarah this quite a while ago, is I remember as a 4 or 5 year old little boy, and during the summer, they would have a parade, and then they would start our county fair. The parade would have a large group, and it had multiple large groups of Indians, and they would be wearing the headdress and things like that. Now, I grew up during a time when TV was all around Westerns, and from Bonanza to Daniel Boone, all of those. And I was petrified. I got behind my grandparents and stood there crying, thinking that these Indians were going to come and kill us. Fast forward to about a decade ago, and at the Palace of Legion of Honor, which is a wonderful museum in San Francisco. It's actually exists because of the Spreckle family, who were agricultural tycoons, both here in California and in Hawaii. There was an exhibit that was the Mayan exhibit, Mayan art exhibit. And what was fun and exciting about this exhibit is it brought together a large amount of art from the Maya people from all different sources, some from private collections, most from public collections housed in Mexico City and the Yucatan. And as I walked through, I was shocked at how many people had to, or the power of those people in what they created, and it changed my worldview. I told Sarah that I wanted to bring a little bit of Mormon history into this discussion, and there's going to be a much longer discussion, so I don't want to take too much time in doing this, because there's going to be a much larger discussion with Sarah tomorrow, talking about Will Bagley's latest book, and you'll get to hear Elise Boxer and Darren as well. Matter of fact, there's a book, Darren Perry wrote an introduction to a book. It's called, what is it? American Indian and Mormon History. It's edited by Jane Hafen and Brandon Rensick. The book is amazing. I've only been able to read bits and pieces because my life has been quite complicated with COVID-19. But there's, in Darren's introduction, and I had never heard this, and I thought I knew a great deal about Mormon history, but this was shocking to me. Peter Mon, he was a church leader in the Cache Valley, and here's what he said to the people in the Cache Valley just before Connor came. And Connor was a U.S. military general. He loved to kill, and he loved to kill Indians. And the battles that not only, well, they weren't really even battles, they were massacres of people that he did. The worst of all was at Bear River in northern Utah and southern Idaho. This is what Peter Mon, who was a church leader in Cache Valley, said. With extraordinary good luck, the volunteers will wipe them out, meaning the Indians, the Shoshone. We wish this community rid of all such parties. And if Colonel Connor can be successful in reaching that bastard class of humans who play with the lives of the peaceable and the law-abiding citizens in this way, we shall be pleased to acknowledge our obligations. Nauvoo, with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young as leaders, had what was called the Council of 50. We don't have really good minutes for the Joseph Smith era because he had William Clayton bury the minutes, and water soaked them up and pretty much destroyed them. So William Clayton had to recreate the minutes for that period from his own journals and from memory. But Joseph Smith talks quite a bit about meeting with the indigenous people from the plains, and he would invite them into Nauvoo, and they would have these meetings. This all was centered around the Council of 50. Well, the Council of 50 was the kingdom of God that would wipe out all other organizations on the earth. So that means there would no longer be the United States government or Great Britain, that the kingdom of God would rule the earth. You have to wonder why Brigham or Joseph Smith's meeting with these Indians. Brigham Young makes it clear in his meeting minutes, because his minutes were actually taken and kept while he was chairman. And if you turn to some different dates, there was Tuesday, March 18th, 1845, and Tuesday, March 11th, 1845, are maybe the two most disturbing. But Brigham Young talks about wiping out all of the people except for the people, the Israelites. Guess who the Israelites are? The Mormon people and the indigenous people that he's having these meetings with. Now, the indigenous people had no idea that this was going on. But Brigham Young talks about when they're going to go west, the indigenous people are going to be excited to see them. they're going to get to wipe out all these people. That's in the minutes. I was shocked by this. Brigham Young even says it's the best thing that can happen to all those people, the Gentiles, and we can then baptize them all for the dead. I thought, where in the world would he get that from? You know, I mean, Joseph Smith was not nearly as explicit, again, because of the reason we have. Well, Third Nephi is really fun because it's all taught there. And I'm not going to read it because it's quite long. But if you go to Third Nephi 16, verses 8 through 16, you can read about how the plan is in the Book of Mormon to wipe out all the white people using the Lamanites. Third Nephi 20:13 through 20 also gets into that. I don't want to take any more time, so I actually want to turn the time back over to Sarah and Andrew and let them take over.
At the end there, when you said they wanted to use the Lamanites, I think that a lot of early Mormons had a different idea of what would happen because they truly believed in the scripture, so they thought that Lamanites would just join the church in droves and be one with the people. They didn't understand that the Lamanites were completely different in their beliefs and their culture and their customs, and there was no acceptance for that. So that's why there was an unrealistic belief in using the Lamanites. They thought they would all become one people.
Right, Sarah. Matter of fact, you just, because of what you just said, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, go for it.
That. But, you know, I sent you that diary entry from Warren Foote where, and we always wonder why the Missourians were so fearful, particularly in Jackson County. Why were the Missourians so fearful of the Mormons? Well, Warren Foote's journal for 1846 in the summer, because the Mormons have now left Nauvoo and they're in the plains and they're going to head on to the Great Basin, though they actually at the time had no idea that that's really where they were going. But the point is Warren Foote records one of the people, and this woman is there on the border of Iowa and Missouri, and her husband is gone, so she's there with just the children, and she hears about Mormons being just north of them in Iowa, and she is flipping out because the Mormons are coming in. Matter of fact, they're actually coming into her property. The Mormons are wanting to work and they're wanting to sell goods because they need money. Well, she interprets this as the Mormons are coming there and they're going to be bringing Indians with them and they're going to kill them all. Where did they, you know, when I first read that I learned that before I learned about the Council of 50. But then, you know, and I'm oblivious to the fact that it's actually in the Book of Mormon. No wonder these people were so fearful. They played upon the prejudice of people, and then they said, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to wipe you all out. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on any of that? Or?
Yeah, well, if I can just add a couple of things real quick, because I want Sarah to have most of the time. Sarah hasn't mentioned one excellent resource, and I hope she doesn't get mad at me for throwing this out here, but she has an excellent website called Lamanite Truth that goes into more details of all the things she said today. So I would encourage people to check out her website because she has many detailed posts that can go into a lot more time than what we have in a 60-minute session. A couple of other things, books or resources if you're looking into this subject more. Decolonializing Mormonism, which was edited by Gina Colvin and Joanna Brooks, has a number of essays in it, including by Elise Boxer, who will be speaking on our panel tomorrow, and others. Elise's is called This is the Place, Disrupting Mormon Settler Colonialism, and it has so many excellent resources there. I would also encourage you to check out this book by Darren Perry, Bear River Massacre, a Shoshone History. It's the first history of the Bear River Massacre written by a Native American, not by a white person interpreting what happened, but by a member of the Shoshone people. And this tragedy didn't just take place in the 19th century. After the massacre, the Shoshone people were resettled in several different places. Eventually, they were given some land in northern Utah that they named Washakie, and they had a city there for many years. And basically in the 1960s, the church came in and said, oh, by the way, we own all this land and we're turning this into a farm now. And they basically burned the people out of their homes. Local church leaders came and burned all the homes down and drove the people out. So this isn't something that just happened hundreds of years ago. This is within, the lifetimes of some of us here. And then one quick comment, Sarah mentioned earlier, the Book of Mormon stories song, and many of us grew up with that. About 20 years ago, I was a student at BYU in a film class, and we were our teacher played several segments from John Wayne movies, and every time the Indians are kind of sneaking up, they had the same basic music, and he played all these old clips, and every time the Indians are about to attack, there's this music, bum, 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 and it's the same little pattern of music, and he started playing it on the piano, bum, 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 and then he starts singing Book of Mormon stories to this music from these John Wayne movies. And it was interesting to see that the church basically lifted the stereotypical Indian Native American music from John Wayne movies from 1940s and 50s Western movies and turned that into the Book of Mormon story song, because that was what connected with the white people that were singing it. Anyway, I want to throw it back to Sarah. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we've got about 15 minutes left. I've got the questions all in front of me, so I think I'll hit some of the questions. There's some really good ones. Some of the questions that have been asked. One is, do you think there is any redeeming the narrative, or is there too much that is damaging in the text? Which is kind of similar to someone else's question who said, how should we use the Book of Mormon as a sacred text, given that the narrative has done harm to Indigenous people? So this will probably be the longest answer out of the questions that I have here, but as Native Americans, we've experienced trauma everywhere. Like, this isn't just Mormon history, this is just American history. And one thing to really keep in mind is two major things. To understand Native American history, you can't understand it without these two things. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. I was 1 year old when it was passed. So I wasn't even born in a time where Native Americans had religious freedom. Before that act, Native Americans could be arrested for participating in any of their traditional ceremonies, including just dancing. So the trauma is generations of people not being allowed to be religious. What that means for the people surviving, okay? Which is why at the end of what I read earlier, that I said, I'm proud that my Indigenous ancestors survived and that they found peace in any of the religions they joined, because I didn't live their experience. They found peace and hope in any place they could find it because there was so much trauma. With that trauma, the second thing, that you cannot understand Indigenous history unless you know what was done to the children. Within the Lamanite placement program, the Indian placement program, where children were taken from schools or from their homes and put into Mormon families to go to school, they were baptized often without understanding what it meant. And then once they were in that program, the Lamanite placement program, the Indian placement program, they were given basically a seminary class teaching them all about being Lamanite and tying it into the Book of Mormon. So that was done to children. That's going to affect generations of people. Read about boarding schools in the US. It started in the 1800s, where children were forcibly taken from their families and put into schools. We're talking many generations of trauma of children being taken from family, shamed for their culture, shamed for their darker skin, hairs forcibly cut regardless of spiritual significance. It's a lot of trauma. So when it comes to Mormonism and the narrative, I look at that act of 1978, Religious Freedom Act, and there is no way I'm going to judge another Native American for finding peace in Mormonism just because I didn't. They've already experienced enough of being told what to join and what not to join. So as far as the narrative in the Book of Mormon, this is why I focus more on let's stop labeling people incorrectly. Because once we take that narrative and say, hey, this is an inspirational, mythical thing, you're not having these people carry the trauma. At least the children aren't being raised with this as being real. Do I think it's redeemable? The skin issue is still an issue. That just needs to be taken out. There's been enough changes in the Book of Mormon. I think one small change. The thing that I actually like and appreciate about Mormonism is it is ever changing. And they're not scared of eventually making that change. At least I hope. But Mormonism is more than leaders or the books. It's also the people. And my experience, while the teachings were kind of traumatic, there's also so much beauty with the people themselves. So I lean more towards religious freedom because Native Americans have had that taken away so much that I'm not going to be somebody that tells them, hey, it's not okay to believe in whatever. Now, also, if one of my family members wants to read the Book of Mormon and join the church and they're like, I'm a Lamanite, I believe I'm a Lamanite, that's completely different. That's self-determination than having a corporation teach millions of people that this is factual. It's completely different when it's self-determination versus being told, oh, you don't know your indigenous history. This is who you are. So self-determination, religious freedom, and hopefully changing some of the harder issues. Now, some of the other questions, this one was, I had my DNA analyzed. I realize each nation has its own history, customs. I'm desperate to learn as much as I can. What can we do to help our First Nations people? A lot of times people say, oh, you need to reconnect with your tribe. You need to get involved with your tribe. And that sounds great, if you have a tribe. Federally recognized tribes, for example, part of the Indian Removal Act was if a tribe didn't want to leave their ancestral lands, they didn't get to be recognized as a tribe. So it was like, to be recognized federally, they had to move. There's a lot of indigenous people out there that belong to tribes that aren't federally recognized. And it's hard to reconnect with the tribe if you know who your tribe is and you have family in it, then I'd say that's the first step, is reconnecting with your tribe. But the other thing you can do is learn indigenous ways of thought and being. And what I mean by that is I was completely kind of removed from my culture as a Tsimshian. And I had to get to a place where I could balance myself. So respect the paths of those who went before you. Like, we don't know what made them join Protestants or Catholics or Mormonism. They had all kinds of trauma and experiences. Support their paths. And for me, one of the things that centers me as an indigenous woman is that my grandma taught me that children are to be the most respected. The younger the person, the more respect you give them. And so when I'm talking about Lamanite truth even, my family's all, my parents and my siblings are all still Mormon. I'm the only one that left. And it's caused some massive breaks and problems. But no matter what, as long as I'm respecting the next generation, that is respecting the older generation, even if they don't understand what you're doing. So as far as being indigenous or finding, reconnect with your tribe if you can. If not, start reading about Native American philosophy and just healing your spirit, and always respect children first. What is another question here? I guess this question is for Sarah. I wonder about indigenous peoples that, because of their upbringing, identify with the Lamanite myth. I grew up Polynesian that really identified with that label, or groups like Lamanite Generation. Yeah, I've thought a lot about the Polynesians. because of the level of appropriation that's happened there is a little unique. But I don't know. You know, I think I keep going back to the same type of feeling and answer, which is, you know, centering yourself with culture. And part of Indigenous culture is very much respecting elders and respecting children. And that to me has been the most healing part of my journey. If that didn't answer your question, write to me or text me or well, email me on the Lamanite Truth site. There's a lot of questions and we've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm trying to answer some of these. But I don't know if I really answered what you needed for the Polynesian question, so I'd love to talk more about that. The Lamanite placement programs, yeah, I did kind of cover that. Do you know about its origins? Its origins are fairly simple because in America, there was this idea of kill the Indian, save the man. It was get rid of the culture to save the person. It had religious context, even though we're supposed to, you know, American history is separate government from religion, but it was very influenced by religion. And, you know, the Lamanite placement program was simply one of many. And especially in Lamanite history, it was our cultures were a sign that our people had turned away from God. Just like that missionary said, there was no religion because we weren't Christian. There's that idea that our traditions were a symbol of us turning away from God. So I would go home. There was this one year I wanted to dance. I was finally old enough to join the dancing, and I was told, no, we don't do that. We don't dance. Because that is part of our people turning away from God. Now, this was also from a parent that grew up in a time that didn't have the Religious Freedom Act, where dancing was demonized. So yeah, Lamanite placement program was just part of what was happening in the country. Let's see. My in-laws are from Central America. They are members of the church and are proud to be called Lamanites. They have asked me why I no longer believe. How do I kindly address my doubts? My mom's very proud to be a Lamanite. My siblings too. Honestly, when they asked me why I left, I knew how much their faith meant to them. And so I told them that out of respect, I didn't want to affect their testimony, which might seem weird for me because I'm so outspoken about the Lamanite issue, but I told them, I'm doing a website, don't go look at it unless you really want to know the issues. Faith transitions or spiritual journeys are so personal. And I think for older generations, you know, there's some respect that I want to give them. And so I always just kind of focus on the next generation of helping them and respecting and giving space for the older generation. Again, because they went through experiences that I'll never experience. And if this is where they found peace, that matters more to me than demanding that they follow me out of the church or listen to everything I have to say, which is a lot. Let's see. Has the church offered any reparations to Indigenous tribes for stealing their land and the murders and atrocities of the pioneers? Not to my knowledge. The church, of course, got paid from the government, but not to my knowledge that there was any real reparations. If Joe, if you know of any, I don't know. No, nobody knows of any. Yeah, I would think if they had taken care of Indigenous people in some way, that it would be loudly talked about. But I don't know if there's none. Did the church ever renege on agreements with Native peoples? Yes. Simple answer, yes. Even Joe mentioned one where the people had lands and they went to, I think that was when they went to winter quarters, and then when they came back, they reneged on the situation. So do you know if the fact that Mormons were invited to San Pete County by the Indigenous people had any effect on the relations? I don't know much about the history of San Pete County. Do you, Joe? take that as a no. No. Okay. I can see if somebody can
I'm
answer.
sorry, it's hard for me to unmute on this phone.
Oh,
Sorry about that. But yeah, there was something, and that's horrible that I can't remember. There was something about Sanpete County, because Sanpete County had Scandinavian, mainly Scandinavian, and I believe that Will deals with that in a bit in yeah, Andrew's shaking his head. He deals with a bit of that in Whites Want Everything. And so whoever asked that question, if they, well, first of all, everybody should be listening to your session tomorrow. That's going to be an interesting session. But second of all, if you get Whites Want Everything, you'll find out quite a bit about that whole. You even, to show how disgusting this whole thing is, in Tooele, there was some cattle that was stolen from the Mormons. Well, Porter Rockwell and the Mormons go around and they gather up these Indians and they take them and they line them up and they shoot them all and kill them. Well, just so and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether they got the wrong people or the right people, whatever. What they did was horrific. But yeah, they got the wrong people. John Fremont did that in Oregon one time, where he had Kit Carson and people go out and gather up these men that were warriors. They were even a different tribe of who Fremont had his issue with. White people didn't care. They didn't care as long as they killed. And I'm sorry going off on that. It just, your presentation got me really going. Sorry.
thanks for that, Joe. And yeah, the Whites Want Everything. It has so much information. It's almost an overwhelming amount. It's amazing how much Will Bagley was able to put together. So the last question, I think, I'll go back through these when we're done and make sure I answered everybody's. But what is the reaction of Native American tribes to the Mormon origin story? Is there conflict acknowledgement, or is the story thought of in the same way? Most look at those who believe in UFOs. Yeah, it's kind of similar to UFOs. I've never really put it in those terms. But if you go, I don't know if anybody knows who Angelo Baca is. He's a Navajo filmmaker. Years ago, this was like, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, 6 years ago. He made a film called In Layman's Terms. When I first left the church, this was one of the things that just had me in tears. Like I couldn't find laymanite people that had gone through what I had anywhere. I mean, I searched everywhere. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to do something so people can have somewhere to feel a little validated, or like I wasn't crazy, because I kept feeling crazy. So I watched In Layman's Terms, and it was like this first step in healing my indigeneity. If you go to laymanite-truth.com, go over to the resources page at the top, and somewhere on that page is Angelo Baca and a link to watch In Layman's Terms. I highly recommend it. It's just this simple film, and it films what it's like inside a Mormon church. There's a few amazing clips where you're just like, yeah, that's exactly what it was like. And he filmed some indigenous reactions too. So I think that's it. I think I got them all, but I'll double check once we're done here. So I think we're out of time. Is that right, Rick?
Yes, we're out of time. So
just want to say
thanks,
thank
everybody.
you to everyone. Yeah, thank you
Thank our
so much.
Thank you, Sarah. You're
the
fantastic.
wonderful
Thank you.
information you gave us. So we will end this broadcast, but I encourage you to check out the other groups and chats within the Whova app. So thanks again.